Chapter 27, Sections 1 and 2 of J.B. Bury's The Student's Roman Empire, Part 2. Recording by Chris Caron. The Student's Roman Empire, Part 2, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 27, The Principate of Antoninus. Pius, Sections 1 and 2. Section 1, The Administration of Antoninus. The death of Hadrian was welcome to the Roman nobility, to whom he was odious, and the installation of Tims Antoninus as princeps was attached with no difficulties. The Senate wished to signify their dislike of the dead emperor by condemning his memory, but their malice was overcome by the influence of Antoninus, and perhaps also by fear of the soldiers, with whom Hadrian was extremely popular. The dead emperor was duly enrolled among the gods. His body was conveyed from Raise in Rome, and lodged in his own mausoleum. It has been supposed that the name Pius, which Antoninus bore before the end of 138 A.D., was given to him on account of his piety towards his adoptive father. But this is not certain, and others think that he won it by the general clemency of his character. The family of Antoninus belonged to Nemesis in Gallia Narbonensis. It is possible that the amphitheatre, of which the remains are still to be seen there, and the aqueduct, known as the Itant du Gard, were built by this emperor. Both his father and grandfather were consulars. He had himself gone through the usual career of public honours, had been appointed one of the 4 consulars of Italy, and had been proconsul of Asia. He married the sister of Aelius Verus, Annia Galeria Faustina, by whom he had 2 sons who died young, and 2 daughters. Hadrian had willed that one of these daughters, who bore her mother's name Faustina, should marry Lucius Verus, while Marcus Aurelius should marry the sister of Verus. But as Verus was only a child, Antoninus upset this arrangement, and united the younger Faustina with Marcus Aurelius, probably 146 A.D. Shortly afterwards, 147 A.D., he made Marcus his consort in the empire, by conferring on him the proconsular imperium and the tribunician power, along with the special right of proposing 5 measures at one session of the Senate. Marcus bore the title Caesar, which meant that he was presumptive successor, and occupied theoretically the same position which Antoninus had occupied before Hadrian's death. But he took no active part in the administration, and did not bear the title Imperator. The other adopted son of Antoninus, L. Verus, was not admitted to the dignities which were granted to Marcus. His image, indeed, appeared on imperial coins, but he was not entitled Caesar, only Augusti films. It is quite clear that Antoninus did not contemplate the idea of 2 emperors of equal authority. Marcus was to be his successor, and it was for Marcus hereafter, if he chose, to elevate his brother Verus to the position of Caesar. The universal consent of antiquity represents Antoninus as a most estimable man, honourable and dignified, yet affable and condescending. He won golden opinions from all men. His promotion to the highest position in the state did not change his temper or his manners. In private life he was singularly simple and temperate, but however estimable as a man, Antoninus was hardly a great statesman. The rest which the empire enjoyed under his auspices had been rendered possible through Hadrian's activity, and was not due to his own exertions. On the other hand, he carried the policy of peace at any price too far, and so entailed calamities on the state after his death. He not only had no originality or power of initiative, but he had not even the insight or boldness to work further on the new lines marked out by Hadrian. The wall in North Britain is the sole exception. The only administrative changes in his reign were retrogressive. Thus he did away with the 4 judges of Italy. This was a concession to the Senate, and concession to the Senate was one of the notes of policy which distinguished his reign as a reaction against that of Hadrian. If he had been equally estimable as a man, but stronger as a ruler, and less obliging to the Senate. A very different account of his character would have been transmitted to us. He troubled himself little with the provinces, except in so far as to hinder oppression in collecting the taxes, and probably only left Italy once during his reign. He disapproved of imperial progresses on the ground that they were a burden on the provincials, but he was also doubtless influenced by the fact that Hadrian's long absence from Rome had given dissatisfaction. We hear, however, of roads built in various provinces, and of a few other public works, such as the temple of Neptune at Lambaesis. He adopted the reasonable principle of retaining provincial governors and other officials at their posts for long extras. The financial policy of Antoninus was marked by care and economy. The only unfavorable thing that has been said of him is that he was a cheese parer. No extravagance was permitted at his court. Although he reduced the taxes, he left in the treasury at his death a sum of 2,700 million sesterces, 21,600,000, in public largesses. However, he was excessively liberal. There were no less than 9 congiaria during his reign, and his games were not less magnificent than those of his predecessors. In A.D. 147 he celebrated the Ludi Secularis. On the 900th anniversary of the foundation of the city, he built a temple to the deified Hadrian and completed the emperor's mausoleum. The reign of Antoninus, as has been already said, was marked by peace, the result of Hadrian's able policy on the frontiers. The only serious warfare was in Britain. There were some trifling disturbances, which do not deserve to be dignified by the name of wars, in other quarters. The governors of the Danube provinces had to deal with the Dacian revolt, and Greece was surprised by the invasion of a marauding band of Kostobuks, probably a Samaritan people, who penetrated as far as Aletia in Phocis Olbia, had to be protected against the attacks of the Scythians of Taurica, and the Alans had to be beaten back more than once from the American borders. There were Aegean, some Jewish disturbances in the east, and some Moorish disturbances in Africa. A revolt in Egypt induced the emperor to leave Italy, seemingly the only occasion in which he made a provincial expedition during his long reign, about 154 A.D. About the same time difficulties had arisen with King Vologeses IV in reference to Armenia, and here perhaps Antoninus was led, by his love of peace, into adopting a weak policy, and sacrificing to temporary tranquillity the interests of a more permanent settlement. Peace was made in 155 A.D., but the inevitable war broke out in the following reign. The prestige which Rome enjoyed at this time in the eyes of neighbouring peoples is shown by the fact that the Lazi of Colchis and the Quadi asked the emperor to appoint their kings. The activity which was displayed in Britain is contrasted with the inactivity in other parts of the empire. The Higrantes rebelled, and were defeated and thoroughly reduced by Q. Lollius Urbicus, 140 A.D. The Legatus, under his direction, a new line of fortification was constructed between the firths of Clota and Bogoria, Clyde and Forth, at the narrowest part of the island. The work was begun in 142 A.D. It was not such an elaborate construction as that of Hadrian's, but consisted of a fosse about 40 feet wide and 20 feet deep, and an earth wall, now known as Graham's Dyke. On the southern side of the fosse it did not run along hills like Hadrian's wall, but through level country for a distance of about 37 miles, from Caridian on the Forth to West Kilpatrick on the Clyde. South of the fosse ran a military road, along which were 10 camps, surrounded with mound and ditch. The north side of these camps, which coincides with the wall, is always closed up. The wall of Antoninus, like the wall of Hadrian, was intended to be both a check on the country to the south of it, and a basis of operations for further conquests to the north. The Roman government had not abandoned the design of subjugating the whole island. This is proved by the circumstance that the camps of the wall of Antoninus are not the most northerly Roman positions. The remains of a Roman camp are still to be seen at Ardoch, north of Stirling. The energetic policy pursued by Antoninus in Britain secured for that country peace and prosperity for 60 years. This fact suggests that he might have better consulted the interests of the empire, and averted the troubles which befell in the reign of his successor, if he had acted with like vigour on the Danube and on the oriental frontier. It is in the field of law that the chief importance and credit of the Principate of Antoninus lie. The same temper which made him somewhat weak in his foreign policy made him strong in jurisprudence and legislation. The importance of his reign in the history of Roman law is not due to any single sweeping reform like the final redaction of the Perpetual Edict by Hadrian, but to the spirit which guided his measures. Antoninus laid special stress on equity, while on the one hand he was no rash innovator, ready to tamper unscrupulously with the written law. He entertained, on the other hand, no superstitions, reverence for the letter. He invariably consulted the dictates of equity and humanity, and introduced into Roman law many important new principles, conceived in this spirit. The view which he took of the administration of justice is thus expressed by himself: although traditional forms must not be lightly altered, yet when demonstrable equity demands, it is necessary to intervene. The activity in jurisprudence which marked the reign of Antoninus, and prepared the way for the golden age of Roman law at the beginning of the 3rd century, must be partly at least imputed to Hadrian's reform on the imperial castellum, described in the last chapter. One of Hadrian's consfliarii, P. Salvius Julianus, who had codified the edict, was also active under Antoninus, by whom he was promoted to be consul and prefect of the city. The chief lawyers by whom the emperor was assisted were 5 in number. L. Fumus Abernius Valens, an author of legal treatises, L. Volusius Mescianus, were chosen to conduct the legal studies of Marcus Aurelius, and author of a large work on Fidei Commissi, testamentary trusts, L. Ulpius Marcellius, a prolific writer, and 2 others. Some of these lawyers belonged to the Proculian school, like Ulpius Marcellus, others to the Sabinian, like Valens, so that the decisions of the imperial council steered a mean way between the 2 opposite schools. Of the attention which was given to the study of law at this period is shown by the appearance of the Tristes of Gaius, an elementary manual for beginners, probably published about 161 A.D. Of the author we know absolutely nothing. Even his name is uncertain. It has already been that there is a tendency under the empire to elevate the condition of slaves, and this tendency was zealously promoted by Antoninus. He passed measures to facilitate enfranchisement. His decision in one case will illustrate his spirit. A female slave was to have been made free by a fidei commissum, but chance circumstances caused the act of enfranchisement to be displayed. In the meantime she gives birth to children, and the question arises, are the children to be slaves or free? Antoninus decided that in such a case the children shall be free, as it would be unfair that they should suffer on account of the accident which retarded their mother's emancipation. In criminal law, Antoninus introduced the important principle, which, though now universally recognized in theory, is not always respected in practice, that accused persons are not to be treated as guilty before trial. He also asserted the principle that the trial was to be held, and the punishment inflicted, in the place where the crime had been committed. He mitigated the use of torture in examining slaves by certain limitations. Thus he prohibited the application of torture to children under 14 years. Though this rule had exceptions, it would be as absurd to blame this humane prince for not abolishing the practice of torture altogether, as it would be to blame him for not abolishing slavery. He deserves great credit for what he did in mitigation of both institutions, but the abolition of either was quite beyond the scope of the imagination of any men of this time. The universal use of torture in Christian countries until recent times illustrates the supposed necessity of its use. One of the most striking features in the criminal legislation of Antoninus is the account taken of social rank. There was always under the empire a social distinction of freemen into two classes, the humiliores, men of low degree, and the honestores, men of high degree. The criterion of this distinction was mainly wealth. The honestores were practically the rich, the humitores the poor. Under Antoninus this unwritten distinction is recognized by law, but we cannot tell whether he was the first to waive official recognition. There can be little doubt that it had been influenced practice, actually, if not confessedly, before his time, but now the law becomes openly and officially a respecter of persons. There is a law becomes openly and officially a respecter of persons. There is a different justice for the base and for the noble. Different penalties are assigned for the same offence, according as it is committed by a humilitor or a honestior. Show me the man, and I will show you the law. It is not merely the practice of the judge, but the principle of the legislator, and it was a principle against which no one grumbled. Antoninus differs from his predecessors in being personally a religious man, and really devoted to the worship of the natural gods. With Augustus, religion had been mainly a matter of policy. Trajan had been indifferent. Hadrian was a sceptic, but Antoninus took very seriously the religious duties which devolved upon him as Pontifex Maximus and member of other colleges. In this respect, contemporaries compared to him Numa. The Senate erected a monument to him on account of his zeal for public religious ceremonies. One can discern in the correspondence of Fronto, the instructor of Marcus in Latin rhetoric, that a certain spirit of piety prevailed in the circle of the imperial family, closely connected with zeal for the maintenance of the national religion. Was the emperor's interest in the antiquities of Roman history. The coins issued on the occasion of the secular games represent the arrival of Aeneas at Latvium, the birth of Romulus and Remus, the shields of Numa, the miracle of the Agora Nazivius, the exploits of Horatius Codus, and other events of the story of ancient Rome. Pallanteum, the Arcadian home of Evander, was promoted to be a city, and immunity was granted to the people of Ilium, the city of Urius. New privileges were granted to Lavinium, but devoted as he was to the pagan religion and traditions of Rome, Antoninus was tolerant of other creeds. He did not, indeed, repeal the laws which were in force against Christians, but he discouraged persecution. Section 2. The private life of Antoninus and his death. The significance of the reign of Antoninus lies just in the fact that it was singularly devoid of striking events. Hence our attention, undistracted by wars or great administrative changes, is naturally turned to the personality of the emperor himself and his private life, and perhaps nothing will better serve to convey an impression of the tranquillity of his reign than the glimpses which we get in the correspondence of Fronto of the simple daily life of the imperial family, and the peaceful atmosphere in which they lived. The loss of his wife, Faustina, who died in 140 or 141 A.D., was a great blow to the emperor, who loved her deeply, as we know from his own words, writing to Fronto, who had praised ab insignum erga ceremonias publicas suram et religionem corp inscur Lot vi 1001. See below, chapter 30, 24. Her in a speech in the Senate. He says, the part of your speech, which related to the honoring of my Faustina by the title Augusta, seemed to me even more true than eloquent, for it is really the case I would not prefer to live with her at Garius than in the place without her. Faustina was a beautiful woman, and scandal was hissy with her name, but there is no conclusive evidence for the truth of the charges of infidelity which rumor brought against her. It seems clear that Antoninus had no suspicions. He heaped honors upon her memory after her death. He was deified. A temple was erected in her honor, and prestigious instituted for her worship. Her image was publicly displayed at the Circensian games. A new alimentary endowment was made in pursuance of the policy of Nerva and Trajan for orphan girls, who were called Faustines. Antoninus did not run the risk of endangering the peace of his family by taking another wife. Gallery Lystrata, a freed woman of Faustina, lived with him in the relation of concubinage, which among the Romans was a legal bond, though inferior to marriage, and involved certain rights for an emperor. It corresponded somewhat to morganatic marriage. The two adopted sons of Antoninus lived continually with their father. True affection and sympathy seem to have bound together Antoninus and Marcus. This comes out in the correspondence of Pronto, and in the meditations of Marcus. At Rome, the imperial family lived in the house of Tiburcius, on the north side of the Palatine. Here the emperor kept up the same social intercourse with his friends as before his elevation. He was not a lover of formality and rigorous etiquette, and he used often to wear the tunic at receptions instead of the official toga. He was obliged, however, to resign himself to maintaining the immense staff of domestics, which had come to be considered indispensable in the imperial palace. Although he was excessively simple in his dress, he had several officers of the wardrobe. We meet at his court a servant, whose sole duty it was to announce the names of visitors; nomenclator, a silentarius, on whom it devolved to keep silence among the slaves; a paedagogos perorum, who instructed the pages; and many others. Antoninus did not take the same personal interest in philosophy and literature, which had been a characteristic feature in Hadrian, but he patronized men of letters, and gathered them about him at his court, mainly for the sake of his son, by whom they were really appreciated. M. Cornelius Fronto shared the intimacy of the emperor, as well as of Marcus, his pupil. Herodicus Atticus, the roaster of Marcus in Greek rhetoric, was also highly favoured. Junius Rhetisticus, a Stoic philosopher, who exercised a great influence over the mind of the young Caesar, who belonged to the court circle. But it is in the country, not in the city, at his village, not in the Palatine, that we get the most pleasing pleasure of Antoninus and his family. He was born and brought up in the country, and we love nothing so well as rural life. Whenever he could, he left Rome for his house at Lorium, on the Aurelian way, or for Trajan's villa at Umtucalis, overlooking the sea, for Signa in Latium, or for Campania. The villa of Lorium, not far from Rome, seems to have been his favourite residence. It was there that he died. In the country his pastimes were hunting and angling. Letters of Marcus to his beloved master describe how the days passed by in simple occupations, riding, reading, writing, talking nonsense with Faustina the younger, whom he calls my little mamma. There is a delightful description of the vintage at Signa. The emperor and his family all dine in the winepress, and listen to the jests of the peasant. A characteristic anecdote is told of Antoninus and the sophist Polemon. When Antoninus was proconsul of Asia, he entered the house of Polemon at Smyrna without being invited, assuming that he would be welcome. Polemon happened to be absent, but he returned in the course of the night, and turned the governor, Bag and Hagag, out of the house. Antoninus said nothing at the time, but sought shelter with some more hospitable inhabitant. But he did not forget the insult, and had afterwards opportunities of revenging himself by witty words. When he was emperor, Polemon visited Rome, and Antoninus made him welcome. "Give Polemon apartments," he said, "and see that no one turn him out of doors." An actor of tragedy complained that he was expelled from a dramatic representation, at which Polemon was presiding, just when he was about to begin his path. "At what hour of the day?" Antoninus asked. "Do you say that he drove you from the stage?" "At midday." "Ah, he drove me out of the house at midnight, and I made no complaint." But perhaps the liveliest idea of his personality will be gained from the picture of him, which has been drawn by his adopted son. "In my father," Marcus writes in his Meditations, "I bad an example of mildness of manners, and firmness of resolution, contempt of vainglory, industry, and perseverance. He was accessible to all who had counsel to give on public matters, and invariably allowed to everyone his due share at consideration. He knew when to relax, as well as when to labour. He taught me to forbear from licentious indulgences, to conduct myself as an equal among equals, to lay on my friends no burden of servility, neither changing them capriciously, nor passionately attaching myself to any. From him I learned to be self-sufficing and cheerful in every fortune, to exercise foresight in public affairs, and not to be above examining the smallest matters without affectation, to rise superior to vulgar acclamations, to worship the gods without superstition, and serve mankind without ambition. In all things to be sober and steadfast, not led away by idle novelties, to be content with little, enjoying in moderation the comforts within my reach, but never repining at their absence. Moreover, from him I learned to be no sophist, no pedant, but a practical man of the world, yet at the same time to give due honour to true philosophers, to be polite in manner, neat in person, and to attend to my health, so far as to rid myself of the need of medicine and physicians. Again, to concede, without a grudge, their preeminence to all who specifically excel in legal or any other knowledge, to act in all things after the usage of our ancestors, yet without pedantry. My father was ever prudent and moderate. He neither indulged in private buildings, or in excessive largesses, or extravagant shows to the people. He looked to his duty only, not to the opinion that might be formed of his actions. He was temperate in the use of baths, modest in dress, indifferent to the beauty of his slaves. Such was the whole character of his life and manners. Nothing excessive, nothing rude, nothing ever done. It might be said of him as of Socrates, that he could both abstain from and enjoy the things which men in general find it hard to abstain from at all, and cannot enjoy without excess. The appearance of Antoninus, as we know it from his busts, corresponds to the written records of his character and temperament. They present the features of a man who was grave yet gentle, firm yet kind, robust and earnest, but neither austere nor coarse. He died in his villa at Lorium, from the consequences of a cold, on March 7th, 161 A.D., in the 74th year of his age. In his last hours he was careful to show forth clearly his wishes as to the succession. The praetorian prefects, Alfurius Fabius, Victorinus, and Sextinus Cornelius Repnus, were summoned to his bedside, and in their presence he recommended Marcus Aurelius as his successor, and made no mention of Alverus. He then commanded that the golden statue of Fortune, which stood continually in the imperial bedchamber, should be removed to that of Marcus, in token of the transference of the Principate to the presumptive successor. The tribune of the praetorian cohort in attendance then entered and asked for the watchword. Equanimity, replied the emperor, expressing in this his last utterance. By spirit of his reign, his end, says the historian Quadratus, was most peaceful, like a sweet sleep. There was no dissenting voice in the Senate when it was proponed to decree to this beloved sovereign a public funeral, and consecrate his memory. An immense funeral pile, in the shape of a pyramid, was erected in the Campus Martius, crowned by a statue of the dead emperor standing in a chariot. As the pyre was being consumed, an eagle was allowed to escape as a token of the apotheosis of the dead, and then Marcus and Lucius pronounced funeral orations in the Forum. A great spectacle of gladiators in the Flavian amphitheatre was an indispensable part of the solemnities. Antoninus had erected a temple to the divine Faustina on the Sacred Way, close to the Forum, 140 A.D. This temple was now transformed in such a way as to serve for the worship of both Antoninus and Faustina. It still stands, one of the best preserved ancient buildings of Rome, and the inscription on the fade may still be read: Divio Antonio et Divis Faustine ex 8 c. Consecrato of Antonius Anna Faustita, from pedestal of the column of Antonius Pius. End of chapter 27. Recording by Chris Caron, Ham Lake, Minnesota.